Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today, we're going to go over things we learned from week 1 of the 2021-2022 college football season. Before we get to that though, please be sure to like this video, subscribe to my channel, share this video with anyone else you think would enjoy it, and turn on the notifications so you will be alerted to when a new video drops on my channel. I greatly appreciate all of the support. All right, now to the video. So week 1 of the college football season is in the books. All of the top 25 teams have played. I finished with a 17-3 overall record for the picks, which I'm very happy about. A couple of upsets. One I didn't see coming. One that I was like, well, okay, I can imagine that one happening. But I'll cover that in the next pick video later on this week. For right now, I just want to review 5 things that I learned after this weekend of college football action. First, many teams weren't ready to play in week 1. It seemed like for certain teams across the country, week 1 kind of snuck up on them. And they were going, oh crap, we actually have to play football now in front of stadiums full of people. Washington lost at home to an FCS team in Montana and only scored 7 points. They were clearly not ready for week 1. Oklahoma struggled against Tulane. Tulane scored more than 17 points against a Power 5 opponent for the first time ever, and they played that game at Oklahoma. They had to move it. It was supposed to be played in Tulane, and they had to move it to Oklahoma, but still, it was played at Oklahoma's home territory. They ended up not having to do any traveling for this, so they weren't exactly ready despite the fact that they won that game. Neither Penn State or Wisconsin looked like they were ready to go in that game. They both made a lot of mistakes. They both played crappy football. Neither of them looked like they were ready to go. North Carolina, the number 10 team in the nation, was upset by Virginia Tech. I'll talk more about that coming up. Iowa State struggled against Northern Iowa. Even though I said in my pick video that was going to happen, I was thinking Iowa State would struggle for a half, maybe a bit into the third quarter, and then they take off and start separating themselves from Northern Iowa. But that game was tight from start to finish. 16-10 is what the score ended up being for that one. Ohio State had a tight game going into the second half against Minnesota. It seemed like there were a lot of teams that were just not completely prepared for week 1. They didn't look sharp. There was a lot of sloppy football played. Hopefully that'll work itself out through week 2, and then we can start rolling with some good quality football game after game after game going forward. The second thing we learned is that despite other teams' struggles, Alabama just keeps rolling. No pun intended. They beat down Miami of Florida 44-13. The number 14 ranked team in the nation just got absolutely demolished by Alabama. New quarterback Bryce Young was 27 of 38 for 344 yards and 4 touchdowns. It's the first time in Alabama's history that a quarterback making their debut has thrown 4 touchdown passes. They only had 147 rushing yards on the game, which I think is probably not something to be super concerned about, but if you have to criticize anything about that performance, that would probably be the one thing. 7 wide receivers had 2+ catches, or 7 receivers, I should say, had 2+ catches in the game. So Bryce Young was not focusing on one target. He was spreading the ball around to multiple targets throughout the game. Their defense had 4 sacks, 2 interceptions, and held Miami to just 178 passing yards and 88 rushing yards. So that team is loaded for bear. They look like they're in midseason form already, and they clearly established themselves as the number 1 team in the nation. And as right now, even though it's only, one game, clearly the favorite to win the SEC West. And I would say not necessarily the favorite to win the SEC, considering what I'm about to talk about next, but they'd probably be favored in that game as well, even if they were playing the next team that I'm going to talk about. The third thing I learned is that the Georgia Bulldogs defense is going to be nasty this year. That game against Clemson, they beat the number 3 ranked team in the nation. They held Clemson's quarterback, DJ Uiagalelei. Excuse me. I thought I had that down, and then the first time I need to say it on a recorded video, I end up screwing it up. DJ Uiagalelei, they held him to 50% passing, 178 passing yards, less than 5 yards per attempt, and an interception. Georgia's D had 7 sacks, 8 tackles for loss, and they held Clemson to 2 rushing yards for the game. That's considering all the yardage lost from sacks, which counts against your rushing stats. But even if you don't count that, Clemson still would have only had 24 rushing yards for the whole game. I recall saying in my picks video that the biggest loss for Clemson was not necessarily going to be Trevor Lawrence, it was going to be running back Travis Etienne and all that he does. And that seemed to be borne out in this first game. It's not that Georgia's offense was doing all that great, though. They only scored 10 points in that game. JT Daniels had less than 200 yards passing. Their running attack wasn't that good. The only touchdown that was scored was a pick 6 by their defense. So if you're Georgia, I would be a bit concerned about getting your offense rolling, although from what I understand, there were 3 or 4 big players that were out for injury. So once they get back into the swing of things, maybe that offense picks up and can actually start scoring some points and putting some drives together. But man, that defense just looks like it's going to be nasty. And if everything breaks Georgia's way, they're looking at yet another matchup against Alabama. As good as Georgia's defense looks, right now, I would definitely give the edge to Alabama because their offense just looks like it's going to be unstoppable this season. Bryce Young is going to make his mistakes. He's going to take his lumps and he's going to throw some interceptions and he's going to have to learn. But it just looks like they've got the weapons to help him out. It looks like they've got the receivers. It looks like that even though they've got a new offensive coordinator, because former offensive coordinator Steve Sarkisian is now the head coach at Texas, it looks like, again, they just keep rolling, hit after hit after hit. But Georgia's defense definitely stole the show in that game and just looked absolutely sick. In that Clemson didn't have an answer for anything Georgia's D was throwing at them. The fourth thing that we learned from week 1 of the college football season is that North Carolina is in trouble. They were upset by Virginia Tech, as I mentioned a few moments ago. Their quarterback, Sam Howell, who many people thought was going to prove himself to be the best quarterback in the nation this year. He was an early Heisman candidate this year. Well, that's gone out the window now. He was 50% passing, 208 yards only, and 3 interceptions on the game. When I was watching that game, he looked very uncomfortable in the pocket. There were a number of times where he would get the snap, he'd fake it to the running back, look up, and then instantly start getting happy feet. Instantly start dancing around the pocket or starting to leave the pocket to try to get himself some more room. It looked like he was anticipating pressure that wasn't yet coming to him. He just looked unsettled the whole game. Granted, a couple of those interceptions were odd bounces off of a defender or off of one of his own wide receivers, but they still count against his stats. They only had 146 rushing yards on the game, less than 5 yards per rush. Their wide receiver, North Carolina's wide receiver Josh Downs, had 8 receptions for 123 of the 208 passing yards. Some other receiver has got to step up and give Sam Howell some help. He cannot just have one target on the outside because defenses will just key in on that. Virginia Tech's defense had the 3 interceptions, as I've already mentioned, along with 6 sacks, despite the fact that North Carolina brought back all 5 starters on their offensive line, so they have an experienced offensive line, and yet they still were just letting Virginia Tech's defense dominate that game. And it's not that Virginia Tech, I think, is going to be all that good. I mean, in terms of total yards, they were outgained by North Carolina, who played like crap in this game. So I don't think Virginia Tech's going to necessarily be a monster of a team. I just think North Carolina is that bad. They lost 2 1,000-yard running backs to the NFL from last season's team. They lost 2 starting wide receivers to the NFL from last season's team. And I just think that people who were looking at Sam Howell as this amazing quarterback, Heisman contender, were not taking into consideration all of the losses on offense with the skill positions. Losing 2 1,000-yard rushers is hard to replace. Losing 2 starting wide receivers that are NFL caliber wide receivers is a lot to overcome. And I think North Carolina is going to have a lot of problems generating offense this season. And I think if you're a North Carolina Tar Heels fan, I think there's a lot of reason to be worried about offensive production this season. And then finally, the last thing that we learned from week 1 of the college football season, certainly these aren't the only things that we've learned, but these are some of the things that I think stood out the most, is that the UCLA Bruins are looking pretty good right now. I called this upset in my picks. I was borne outright on that. They beat number 16 ranked LSU 38-27 at home. Dorian Thompson-Robinson, DTR, UCLA's quarterback, had 260 passing yards and 3 touchdowns, despite only passing for about 55-58%. I said that he was going to have to get better if UCLA wanted to do something. He got better from the first game against Hawaii to the second game against LSU. The completion percentage and his quarterback rating were not great. The yards passed were not eye-popping. The 3 touchdowns was good, though. He's going to still need to continue to play better ball if they want to have a shot in the Pac-12, though. He's going to have to be more careful with the ball. He's going to have to increase his completion percentage. He's going to have to increase the yards per game. They did have 210 total rushing yards against an SEC caliber defense and against an LSU team whose strength on the defensive side was their front 7, their defensive line and their linebackers. And they got pushed around by UCLA's offensive line. UCLA's offensive line is big, it's physical, and it looks like it's going to be one of the strengths of their team this season. They had 210 rushing yards against LSU, 4.5 yards a carry, 2 rushing touchdowns to go with DTR's 3 passing touchdowns. Running back Zach Charbonnet, the transfer from Michigan, had 11 rushes for 117 yards. That's 10.6 yards per rush against an SEC caliber defense and a touchdown. In terms of UCLA's defense, they held LSU to 49 rushing yards for the game. If you're an LSU fan, that's very concerning. That's very concerning. UCLA's defense also had an interception along with 2 sacks. LSU quarterback Max Johnson did have 330 passing yards and 3 touchdowns, but most of that yardage went to wide receiver Kayshon Boutte, who had 9 receptions for 148 yards and all 3 of the touchdowns, and he's the only receiver on LSU's side that had more than 50 yards. So just like with North Carolina, somebody else is going to have to step up besides Boutte to give Max Johnson another target going forward. So UCLA played a great game. I predicted that having the first game against Hawaii under their belt was going to be a bonus for them, a benefit for them, because it gave them film that they could watch. It gave them experience that they needed. They played a big game. They won a big opponent. They won against a big opponent. They were so impressive in that victory that Fox Sports' Brock Heward has now predicted that UCLA will win the Pac-12 this year. I'm not ready to go that far. They've got some tough games on their schedule. They've got Arizona State at home. They've got Oregon at home. That's going to be a massive matchup later on in the season. They're on the road at USC in the second to last game of the season. They're on the road against Washington. Despite the fact that Washington lost to an FCS team and didn't look good doing it, And despite the fact that I think that they're going to get bombed out of the building against U of M next week, that could end up being a tricky matchup where maybe UCLA begins looking over them and maybe gets popped. And UCLA is on the road against Utah, which is not going to be an easy game because Utah looks like they're going to be a decent team going forward. Maybe not a great team, but a decent team. I think that UCLA will be in contention for the Pac-12 South. I think that they're going to be playing very important games in November, but I'm not ready at this point with only 2 games under their belt to call UCLA the winners of the Pac-12. I think Oregon is still the class of that conference, and those 2 teams play, so we'll see what happens. And that does it. Those are the 5 things that we learned, the 5 primary things that we learned about college football after week 1 of the 2021-22 college football season. Once again, if you liked what you heard in this video, please go ahead and like this video, share it, make sure you subscribe to my channel and turn on those notifications so you'll be alerted to when new videos drop on my channel. Videos about college football, videos about history, videos about Robert's Rules of Order, videos about anything else that I put on here. Thanks so much for tuning in, everyone. I appreciate the support. Have yourselves a good day, and I will see you all next time.